take a look at Arquebus. This is another in the Men of the Iron series, and the reason that I finally got around to Blood and Roses, I'm going to try to do a quick intro to this. We did the rules very recently with the Blood and Roses game. This one's similar, close enough. I mean, the Men of Iron series really is a series, but it does have a few differences, so I feel like I have to spell those out. These are battles in Italy, the French invasion versus Spanish and Italians, really, for the most part. There are some Italian supporters for the French, but they're kind of worked into the counter mix. One thing I noticed, wow, I'm told this is glossier than the Blood and Roses one. I hate glossy stuff. We have some interesting things here. Let's take a look. So the leader counter now has an effectiveness number. That's going to affect, I believe, the continuation rolls. We'll take a look at what that does exactly. I don't really remember. I've read through these and found my differences, but I don't remember them because it's been a while. Now we also have this current flight level marker. That's a little different. There are some special scenario markers, so that may be one of those. And we have some special markers to handle the arquebuses. Remember the Blood and Roses, we were starting to see some handguns and stuff. Well, here we're a little bit further on. The guns are a little bit more effective, a little bit more modern. The big stand-based arquebuses instead of little hand cannons. The engaged markers, these are going to be used as a combat effect. One of the things we haven't seen in Men of Iron is troops smash into each other and then they're kind of free to leave. This changes that. Not quite sure. Let's take a look at some of the unit types. We got our arquebuses. Let me put a shilling in for musket and pike if you want to see further. We have archers, crossbowmen, great. We have our artillery, a whole bunch of different sizes of artillery ranging from the falconet up to the heavy cannon, and those will be handled in the combat charts rather than, there's not anything really interesting on the counter. Genitors are a light cavalry force that you probably don't want to shock attack with. Of all things, these may be armed with javelins in some cases that they can throw, and you see that marked up here, that -1J. This is another new thing in this representation, which is that there's missile weapons are being represented as sort of a partial armament for some of these units. We have gun wagons, light cav. Now we have normal light cav, and then we have light cav archers who have an archery weapon added to them. And again, you probably don't want to shock attack with these for the most part. We have pike, and a lot of the infantry units are going to have especially as we get deeper into the scenarios, they're going to have a component to the unit which is missile armed. Arquebuses, crossbows, etc. Men-at-arms, these are your knight type units. Mounted crossbowmen and arquebuses. So these are kind of cool. You can see the counter here, but they have a corresponding dismounted counter. Now, what we don't have here is dismounted men-at-arms, and I don't see the counters for an unhorsed result. So we'll look at the combat table, see if troops ever become unhorsed in this version. Stratiopti, more like cav, more heavily armed than the genitor, using mace and sword. Sword and buckler, of all things. So this has largely gone out of favor, right? But this is almost like the Roman legionary forces being attempted again as a counter for the pikes. Now, the problem with that is the incorporation of arquebuses into the pike units. And you have them here, this has arquebuses in it too, ends up making them capable of dealing with these lighter foot troops a little better. Scale is 100 yards. Flight points as normal. We got points for the units. The units may have different point values than you'd expect, though. So like men-at-arms are worth 3 each, but pikes and sword and bucklers are worth 5 each. Now, they may be larger forces, right? An infantry formation of pike may be 500 to 1,000 men, but it's much smaller for some of the others. Let's see. I don't see the missile, the knights being listed with a numerical value there. So, but they're giving you an idea that the amount of troops in a counter is not a fixed amount per counter, or even by strength point or anything. Anyway, that's why the flight points for these units, the infantry units, may be bigger, is that they're so big. You got your normal activation sequence that you see in the Men of Iron series. Okay, the leaders, the effectiveness. All leaders except the overall commander have a bonus which is based on the effectiveness of the overall commander if they're in range of him. This is a nice little modifier. It says, the guys who the overall commander is paying attention to have more of a chance of doing something. And you'll see the only leaders that have this number are the 2 overall commanders, although King Charles does not seem to. Interesting. I guess we assume he's a 0. I don't think there's 2 King Charles. I don't think King Charles would not be the overall commander in a battle, but anyway. So that's going to be an effect on the continuity of the units within range of him. We're going to have our seizure markers, and I forgot to throw them out for the Venetians here. Number of successful continuations, we track that over here. That's going to be a modifier as usual. Special counters here, I think they're pretty much the same as we saw in Blood of Iron, or Blood and Roses, or whatever. Seizure opportunity, seizure negation, battle cry, unsteady troops instead of treachery, because treachery was less common here than in the English Civil War. And into the breach gives you a combat bonus. The battle cry gives you a rally. Some of the units, for example, these artillery here, have no leader on them. The only way you can activate them is with a free activation, and they will be out of command during that. All right, special rules. Dismounting, these are part of the standard for this game, but whatever. They're different from what we've mainly seen. Mounted arquebuses and crossbowmen can dismount, and it costs, I believe, 3 movement points, and they become foot. The big bonus of this is they're allowed to reload their weapons. If they have a fired marker on them, they have to dismount and reload. They can fire their weapons while dismounted if they wish. They have to be in command in order to do this and not have any problems. Artillery, we'll touch this because maybe you didn't watch the Blood and Roses, but because I do cover, I think, the rules in both the original Men of Iron and maybe an Infidel as well. The artillery can be limbered or unlimbered. Once you unlimber it, it will be stuck in place, although you can hand haul it to change facing. We got our front flank, rear facing. This is all standard. Pretty much. Okay, normally there's no stacking in here. They got rid of zones of control in this system. They changed it to adjacency rules. Okay. There's some special stacking in here. Non-pike, non-artillery foot can stack with an unlimbered artillery. Non-artillery can move through friendly unlimbered artillery that are not stacked with another unit, but the artillery can't move through other units. A non-pike foot unit can stack with a baggage wagon. Sappers, I don't know if I saw any in this, they can stack with one other unit except limbered artillery. Unlimbered artillery is the only one you can stack with. Okay, that makes sense. Foot arquebus, foot crossbow, longbow, and skirmishers can move through friendly units that are not limbered artillery, pike, or sword and buckler, which have their own rules. Oh no, it has its own rules about unlimbered artillery. At a cost of 1 movement point for each such hex entered in addition to whatever you spend. And retreats have their own special rules. And what are those? You may not move, retreat before combat, or retreat units that cause units to stack that are not listed as... Yeah, it's kind of in here. Missile fire, if you can fire units in a stack both at the same time, I guess, using active fire, or whenever they move is when that happens. They'll be both affected by missile fire using 1 die roll. For shock and charge effects, stacked units count as a single unit when determining strength advantage. But for the weapon system matrix, they have a series of things that affect it. So like artillery and baggage wagon sappers are not going to add to you. I would guess some of these things like artillery and baggage wagons don't actually determine strength. We'll have to see if that's specified there. When stacked units are attacked by shock charge combat, both units suffer any results, except for baggage wagons who don't. Sappers and artillery suffer the same result as the unit they're stacked with, even if they don't share the same status. So for example, artillery gets destroyed when they're taking this order out. Okay, when things fire is of some importance. So let's take a look at this. Because this has the fired marker. Does it talk about that? Just mounted arquebus and mounted crossbow. Okay, so only when you're mounted do you have trouble reloading. You have your missile DRM, that's going to be written on the counter. That's the value up here. So for example, these guys have a 0 crossbow. They don't get a penalty on their crossbow fire. But they use the charts for the crossbow. We'll take a look at the charts and tables and see what we can get out of this. All right, so active fire, you move a unit, you can fire during its movement. There may be some special cases. Light cav archer and genitors can fire during their movement and continue to move. This is a little different. However, if they're adjacent to the enemy when they fire, it costs 1 movement point to fire. Otherwise, it costs nothing because they got to kind of be more careful not to engage. Something like that. Return fire, if you're fired on by an enemy missile, you're allowed to fire back. If you're non-artillery missile units, you may not use return fire if you're shot through the rear. Pike and sword and buckler with crossbow or arquebus cannot conduct return fire because there's too few missile-armed units to really give cohesive fire, given their rate of fire and this, that, and the other. Reaction fire. If an enemy moves or charges into an adjacent hex, you'll be allowed to reaction fire. These are standard rules, but they're a little different for this system. Genitors, longbowmen, and light cavalry archers may fire each time the enemy enters their frontal hex. That's the standard. Everything else only reaction fires once per activation, and they'll get a fired marker. It's like blood and roses. Except for mounted crossbow or mounted arquebuses, who get the fired marker that says that they're like unable to reload. Artillery units can do active fire. They can do reaction fire when you move or charge into an adjacent frontal hex that doesn't have a unit already in it. And you can only use it once per activation. You mark with the fired marker. The big difference seems to be another unit being in there. 1 reaction fire at an enemy unit when it enters a hex, no matter how many units are adjacent to the hex. Talk about the mounted shock. Retreat before combat. Okay, this is a little funky. And it's nice and glossy for you, so you can't see it. Any mounted unit, foot arquebus, foot crossbow, longbowman, or skirmisher that's not discorded or engaged and is attacked by foot units can retreat before combat. If it's a foot unit, it can retreat 1 hex. If it's a skirmisher or mounted, skirmisher or foot, excluded. It may retreat 1 to 3 hexes. Pike and sword and buckler armed with arquebus and crossbow are not allowed to retreat just because they have some arquebuses or crossbows with them. Each hex retreated increases the distance. The retreated unit must be able to end. What do we got here? Can't enter a path of a charge, an occupied hex, but it can change facing. It becomes disordered at the completion of the retreat. That includes Cav. And the attacker can then follow. The unit that just advanced, though, cannot shock. And there may be some little markers to help indicate that. Okay. We'll worry about things there. Angle of attack looks like it's the same as we have seen recently, I think all along. Leaders add their charisma rating, same as before. We check the comparison and we get a result. Big difference here. Okay, artillery. If artillery is shocked or charged, they don't have a die roll. That may be different, but I don't remember. They are automatically eliminated if they're shock attacked, or eliminated with a continuation if it's a charge. If they're stacked with other non-artillery, they're eliminated if any effect has basically happened. Charging and counter-charging, I don't think this is significantly different. This is something I always have to look up when it happens. So basically you make a roll to see if you can counter-charge. Charging doesn't require a roll. And this I believe it's the same rules as Blood and Roses uses. I may find some differences in play. We'll talk about the combat table. The results are largely what you're used to from the system, except now there's this engaged rule. When activated, okay, if you get an engaged marker, it gets placed on between the units that are fighting. When activated, an engaged unit must either disengage or remain in its hex. It may not fire, and it may not be targeted by fire. It may disengage by moving if it's not disordered or out of command, but it costs an extra movement point to leave the hex. Okay, not big. But if you don't have enough movement points, you can't do it. When you disengage, you'll become disordered. You may not move next to another enemy unit. That's probably wise, but you know. If you're not eligible to shock attack, you must disengage when activated. If you do not disengage and you have none of your units that you're engaged with your frontal hexes, you must turn in order to try to get units in your frontal hexes. If you don't disengage and you have units in your frontal hexes, you cannot turn, and you must declare a shock attack. And you ignore the units that you're not engaged with in that case. Rallying, I think this is standard. Timed engagement, standard rules. And you use the little time counter. This is the same as Blood and Roses. Okay, Swiss Shock. The Swiss units are largely mercenaries, and they're pretty decent, but you have to make a die roll when you order them to go shock, and they may not do it. They may even leave the board. The gun wagons, they can't move. If they retreat or retire, they end up eliminated. That's that. We got one more thing to look at, which is the charts. This is our standard combat value, and you can see the mounted men-at-arms are very good against regular missile units. They're good against the mounted missile units, but they get much. They are not good against pike units. Pike, I don't know if you can even read this. I mean, the glare, yeah, it's the glare that's causing it. I can see it fine, but the camera couldn't. The pike units are not very good, the mounted units are not good against pike, with no big shock there. Pike itself, let's see. Pike itself doesn't attack mounted units particularly well, however. And these, Sword and buckler. Let's see how they work against pike. They're slightly better against pike. Pike against the sword and buckler slightly worse. So -1 down there. All right. What do we got here? Just looking to see if we have anything really exciting in here. I don't see any unhorsings. Let's see if there's on the missile table. That's where it used to be. So there does not seem to be any unhorsing result at all. And the different weapon types. So the arquebus gets bad real quick. Longbow. Okay, these hexes are bigger. They're more territory. You can see that doesn't do very well. Crossbow. Javelins just suck. The composite bow, equivalent to a longbow, basically. But now we got the artillery, which again, you kind of want to be pretty close for you to get a decent value on it. You want a high value, so things that have, trying to see one, some of these guys have a minus on them, probably things like pike and stuff, where there aren't a lot of guns in it. I think that's enough. We'll come back. We're going to be looking at the first of the battles for Novo after I get that set up. I got all the counters set up. I couldn't find a rule for this, the current flight level. Notably, there are no battle retreats or anything like that. That was a rule I really liked in the Blood and Roses. That's gone from here. I think you had maybe more consolidated command at this point. I don't think it was completely unreasonable the troops would get chased off the field. Certainly you start seeing it again in the musket and pike games. So it must have been happening still, but I think the Blood and Roses, it was just such a common occurrence that they wanted to include that as a regular part of the rules. Men of Iron tends to be kind of light and not try to burden you with too many rules. So there's that going. Anyway, that's it. We'll send this up, and I hope I'll get Fornovo done before I leave town, because then it's going to be a couple weeks before the next one.